returning to the world of Starship Troopers to examine the question of how to wage a war on this episode of the Sci Fi Show. This time we're going to consider the question of how a war should be waged and how to settle a peace once a war has been declared. We don't really need to deal with pacifism as a concept here because a pacifist should never find themselves involved in armed conflict in the first place. However, the realist and the just warrior can both find themselves involved in hostilities. Before we get down to that though, I have a question I'd like you to consider. In the film Starship Troopers, who are the bad guys? Who are the aggressors? It's an interesting question that has an answer that's not completely obvious. We'll return to that later in the episode to consider the question further. When it comes to questions of how to wage a war, the realist finds the answer to be fairly straightforward, much as the answer to the question of when to wage a war is straightforward as well. The realist can wage war in whatever fashion best suits their interests to do so. This doesn't necessarily mean carpet bombing the enemy to the Stone Age, and then shooting everyone who crawls from the rubble though. There may be prudent reasons for waging a war on a more restrained basis. After all, if you get a reputation for waging war in a particularly brutal fashion and using prisoners for medical experiments and food, this will probably not favourably dispose other nations towards you, and may even make your enemy fight to the bitter end rather than surrender to such a brutal regime. As the Germans learned in World War II after they massacred POWs during the Battle of the Bulge, the worst thing you can do to an enemy soldier is give them good reason to think, when they're unable to retreat, that they'll be treated badly or killed. Such soldiers have nothing to gain from surrendering, assuming they're dead if they do so. So they assume it's better to fight and have a slim chance of survival than surrender and have none. Such force multipliers are not something you want to encourage among enemy troops. Also, there used to be a principle in warfare among Western nations that you should never deploy weapons if your opponents didn't. It's held true in most modern conflicts where sides have had chemical, biological and nuclear weapons available to them, but have refrained from using them. Although banned in international law, there appears to be somewhat of an unwritten rule that if you don't deploy them, we won't deploy them. And this rule seems to have been in effect since the end of World War I, after the horrors of chemical warfare were fully understood. For the just warrior, the problem is more complex. As with the reasons for going to war, there are also criteria that must be met for the waging of war to qualify as just as well. A realist might agree to a similar set of restrictions on warfare, provided the other side played by those rules as well, but the just warrior is obliged to keep them even if their enemy does not. These are known as jus in bello principles. The first of these is that a belligerent is required to obey all recognised prohibitions on particular sorts of weapons. Chemical and biological weapons are the obvious choices here, and are explicitly banned in treaties. Seems like a prudential as well as a just principle, and has been obeyed by regimes such as Saddam Hussein's Iraqi government when they were on the receiving end of a US-led invasion. Whatever you think of the nature of that conflict, it's interesting that even someone like Hussein was unwilling, or perhaps unable, to use chemical or biological weapons against the US. Perhaps a suitably realist response was feared. Apparently atomic weapons aren't forbidden by international law, but the suggestion of using them is greeted with hostility by the international community. Although in practice, I'm not sure how practical atomic weapons are for any sort of warfare, as you can't target anything much smaller than a city. This brings us to the second principle, the discrimination and immunity of non-combatants. Under just war principles, you are not allowed to deliberately target civilians, you're only allowed to strike legitimate military targets. This is not to say that civilians won't be harmed in armed conflict, but it does say that they cannot be explicitly targeted. An example of a violation of this principle would be the deliberate saturation bombing of residential areas. Factories engaged in war production are legitimate targets, and civilians working in those may be injured or killed, but this is an example of collateral damage. The intent is to destroy the factory and impair or halt production, not deliberately target non-combatants. There's also a question of precision. During World War II, for example, there was a large amount of civilian collateral damage during saturation bombing, but at least some of this was due to the imprecision of bombing in that time. It's also worth noting that attempts to obey this principle have been abused by unscrupulous regimes or groups as they deliberately seek to hide behind the civilian population, either launching attacks from residential areas or building facilities in or around hospitals and schools and other structures. Then, when there is collateral damage from an attack on the legitimate target, the genuinely principled nation that seeks to obey this rule is blamed and accused of deliberately targeting civilians. Third, to adhere to just war principles, a nation must only use force proportional to what is required to achieve the goal. This usually rules out weapons of mass destruction and the like, as well as certain forms of warfare. What qualifies as proportional would depend on the goal. This can be difficult to determine. As we discovered after World War II, sometimes a nation has to be crushed if it is to accept defeat and not simply lick its wounds and start all over again. This was a concern when fighting both the Nazis and the Japanese. The fourth principle is a requirement for the benevolent treatment of POWs. You have to accept an enemy's surrender, and because they are no longer an aggressor, you have an obligation to quarantine them away from the battle zone. This can prove quite tricky, especially when it comes to determining who is protected by such provisions. Do soldiers have to be uniformed? What about saboteur units operating in disguise behind enemy lines? All of these questions are pressing today, given the nature of many recent conflicts, and the tendency of enemy combatants to hide among and dress like the civilian population. Fifth, there is a requirement that all means employed not be mala in se, which means evil in themselves. Typical examples of this would be genocide, treachery, mass rape campaigns against civilians, etc. It also rules out things like bioweapons, whose effect cannot be readily controlled. Finally, the just warrior is forbidden from engaging in reprisals. Even if your opponent violates the jus in bello principles, you are not then entitled to violate them similarly. There's a good reason to think it is prudential not to do so, as it will lead to an escalation in the conflict rather than chastising the other side back into line. After a conflict has concluded and one side has been beaten to the point that they seek peace, it becomes necessary to work out the terms for that peace and an ongoing cessation of hostilities. For the realist, the usual what's best for us principle applies here, as it does at all other levels. The exact form this will take will vary, but as the experience of the crushing armistice of World War I showed, a revenge-heavy, punishing peace is largely an invitation for further hostilities at a later date. For the just warrior, we have a set of just post-bellum principles. There are 7 of these, so let's take a look at them. The realist may use some of these principles as they're likely to lead to a more bearable peace for the defeated enemy. Number 1 is proportionality and publicity. The peace must be publicly proclaimed, no secret backroom deals, and the terms of peace should be reasonable. Using the peace treaty as an instrument of revenge is not allowed, and is usually counterproductive anyway. Number 2 is rights vindication. The rights that were being violated, either by the aggressor nation or against the aggressor's populace, whatever provided the just cause for war, must be put right and restored. Should be the principal goal of peace, as it was the principal goal of the war, to make right the initial wrong. Number 3 is discrimination. Those writing the peace may punish the leaders of the defeated country, and punitive measures may be enacted, but some reasonable attempt needs to be made to spare the civilian population from the worst of these. 4 and 5 are related principles and require that those who violated and abused human rights during or before the war be brought to trial, and held accountable for their actions. This can involve war crimes trials for the leaders of the defeated nation, as well as trials for the soldiers of both sides who violated the human rights of others during the war. If they employed in mala se methods of warfare or deliberately targeted civilians, for example, these trials should be public. Principle 6 deals with compensation. It's not unreasonable for the victor to demand the vanquished aggressor nation make reparations and compensation for the destruction caused by the war they instigated. However, like with everything else, these must be moderated by the principles of discrimination and proportionality. Also, as history richly demonstrates, ruinous reparations that are demanded by the victors is a sure recipe for picking future fights. The final principle on the list of just post-bello principles is a requirement to rehabilitate the aggressor nation, to seek to reform them as much as possible to prevent a repeat of the behaviour. Whatever that may entail, such as retraining law enforcement, demilitarising the country, even deep structural reforms. This principle is the most contested and probably the most difficult to implement. Look at attempts to reform the post-Civil War South or attempts to reform the post-Saddam Iraq or post-Taliban Afghanistan. Germany and Japan may be success stories, but the task is far from straightforward. If you recall at the start, I asked you to consider a question. Who is the aggressor in Starship Troopers, the arachnids or the humans? Although the immediate answer that springs to mind is the arachnids, I'm not sure that's the lesson we are supposed to draw from the film. After all, from the arachnid perspective, the humans, in the form of the Mormon separatists, invaded their space and started the conflict. It's unlikely the arachnids would even be able to conceive of the concept of separatists at all. I was struck the first time I realised that. The humans, well, maybe not the bad guys, they're certainly not unquestionably the good guys. Many of these just war principles will be inapplicable to a war with the arachnids. The bugs just don't take prisoners, and it's unlikely an arachnid warrior is even capable of conceiving of surrender. Likewise, principles of proportionality are unlikely to be applicable, as the bugs seem intent on genocide and extermination. Perhaps if they could be defeated, it may be possible to do something to contain them, but exterminating them might be the only possible solution to the problem. However, among merely human adversaries, there is room for something less extreme than this, however often belligerents may claim otherwise. I hope you've enjoyed this two-part series on theories of warfare. You can find more information on the different ideas contained in this episode in the show notes on scifishow.com. I can be reached with comments via thesciFishow@gmail.com. You can leave comments in the show notes at scifishow.com, and you can also leave comments on our Facebook page, facebook.com/scifishow. You can also follow the show via The Sci-Fi Show on Twitter. If there's any topic you'd like me to look into, please don't hesitate to ask. Let me know what you think. The Sci-Fi Show is recorded under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license, and the music is provided by Furious J Maniacal M.